everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. And if you have not noted, that song has been playing as a part of the discussion for quite a while now. And that discussion is related to the Moorish Aborigines. Moorish Aborigines also might be classified as what are known as Lancados, coming out of Europe, being either cast out or dispatched. Now, we spent a lot of time in the community classroom going over the histories of a number of cultural groups, all the way from Africa to America to Europe to Asia. So we've been all over the place looking at the ancestry and the historical narratives of a variety of groups that have interlocking histories. One history that's been fairly amorphous because it's been merged with so many other identities over time. And so it's taken a while to disentangle this. I have been studying this history, this interlocking history, for a few decades now. And so I'm going to provide to you my conclusions related to individuals who are identifying as Aborigines. We're going to call them the Internet Indians. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the ancestral narratives and the ancestral heritage of that particular group. You've noted them online. They've been very, very active, particularly over the last couple of years. And so we're going to talk about a summation. I'm going to give you a summation of why this is the identity of those individuals for the most part. We are also going to do a little recap of some of the content that we have covered and some of the research that has been shared, that when you pull it all together, you'll be able to see this mosaic which demonstrates who the individuals are. And so this historical narrative is fairly complex. However, it incorporates the narratives, again, from Africa, from Europe, and the Americas. And as always, if this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Okay, now we are going to go over this summation related to some of the dynamics that give rise to the identity of the individuals as Moorish Aborigines. Now, one of the things that many people who identify as ADOS might have noted is that there has been a vehement pushback related to the narratives related to the transatlantic slave trade from the individuals who identify as Moorish Aborigines. Sometimes they don't identify, however, as Moorish Aborigines. They simply identify as Aborigines. However, they are by and large Moorish Aborigines. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. And so there are a few markers that indicate that there is a distinction between these individuals and those individuals who identify as descendants of American chattel slavery, that institution. One of the things you will note with Moorish Aborigines is they have a colonial history in the Americas, and often they are unable to show documentation related to a pre-colonial history. There's also a dynamic of no enslavement history. So you'll hear that pushed a lot. They will often ask about where are the slave ships, and a conflating of identities. And so they will often share that their family, there is no enslavement history. So you've got individuals who are colonial, they don't have an enslavement history. And then they will present the history of their ancestors as employees. And so they will argue against this idea of enslavement and say that the people that they are, the brown people that they are, those individuals were employees and indentured servants in America. So you can see this is a totally different narrative here. This is not the transatlantic slave trade narrative. And so they will push that, but what happens is that those individuals end up disregarding and disrespecting the narratives of others who do not share this same cultural inheritance. Another dynamic that is noted that lets you know that you're talking about a Moorish Aborigine is this history of, during colonial times, individual ownership of land. And this is inconsistent with the joint land ownership of the indigenous people, the American Indians. So this is inconsistent with their dynamics related to land ownership. And if you read the Doctrine of Discovery case, you will see that throughout the case. So this again separates those Moorish Aborigines from the American Indians and the indigenous people of the Americas, those pre-colonial people. You will also hear when they are discussing their ancestors this history of individual entrepreneurship during the time of slavery and Jim Crow. So while other people were enslaved and you were going through Jim Crow, you had another group of people who had ancestors who were entrepreneurs. Also, their ancestors were proficient in European languages. So English, Spanish, French, Portuguese. This is inconsistent with the experiences, the earlier experiences of the Indians and the indigenous people. Another dynamic is that the Moorish Aborigines are classified as Negroid versus Negro. And Negroid is basically a racial admixture. And so Negroid is like a Negro. This is similar to Moorish because Moorish with that ISH indicates similar to a Moor. So you can study that on your own, however. And then another dynamic is a history, a very consistent history of European surnames and no history of a name change from the traditional Indian names. And so they may have some American Indian ancestors, but by and large, the history has been one of European surnames without any change based upon having a slave owner. Because remember, part of the narrative is there was no slavery for their ancestors. You will also notice that Moorish Aborigines have self-given titles, and so they will have titles where they will give themselves positions such as chief. These are not real positions. There are no real tribes that they are over. They will have titles like priestess or empress or things like that. And so those are some other things that sort of identify them as Moorish Aborigines versus indigenous pre-colonial Indians. There's also, if you remember some of the material that we went over, there's also a history with many of the Moorish Aborigines of sort of triracial heritage. And so they will often not talk about this, however, because there's a focus on just being Indian. And there's also a reluctance to share about their European background. But there's also a history, particularly in that northeast area, of having quote-unquote white classified grandmothers. There's also, in terms of genetics, there is a history of having genetics that show a relationship to Iberian people and Middle Eastern genetics. There's also, in terms of socio-cultural dynamics, there is a cultural dynamic of being dramatic. And so, and that also goes along with giving self, these names like chief and priestess and things like that. And also one thing that has been noted just as a sort of observer is that there is a distancing of these groups from traditional pre-colonial Indian groups such as Fauna and such as the Louisiana Chata. So these are some of the sort of red flags that suggest and indicate that the individuals are what would be known as Moorish Aborigines. By Moorish Aborigines, they are, again, the first Moors. They are the original Moors on this land. That does not, however, mean that they are the original indigenous first-in-time people on this land. And we have a little bit more of that music that is dedicated to the Moorish Aborigines. We are also going to now quickly talk about some of the resources that have been used over the decades to come to an understanding of the Moorish Aborigines. And so what you see when you watch the video discussions or you listen to the video discussions, what you see is the culmination of the material. And so you don't actually see the research that was done or how it was done over time. And so we're going to go over some of the research that has been done, where it has been done, and where the information has been collected from. And so some of the places, this is not all inclusive, by the way, but just to give you an idea, some of the places include the Library of Congress and U.S. Archives, also UK Archives, Canadian Archives, Mexican Archives, also the Amistad Research Center, which is at Tulane University in New Orleans, the Bayou Lacombe Library in Louisiana, the Virginia State Courts, the Houma, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Seminole, and Mardi Gras Indian records. Also the Indian treaties and the land records. Also, data comes from court cases and legislation, particularly coming out of Virginia, Louisiana, and Maryland. Also, the slave voyages and the immigration voyages coming out of Liverpool and Bristol primarily. Also, data has come from the Chicago DuSable Center Museum, also from Great Britain, England, France, Germany, and Amsterdam, and that is on the ground, boots on the ground research, and also ethnographic research. And acquiring a good understanding of what's going on historically with individuals identified as brown Americans, it takes quite a bit of field research, and so it takes a lot of time, or has taken a lot of time over the last decades to accumulate the material to come to some pretty solid conclusions related to the diverse backgrounds of individuals who are identified as African American, Black, Negro. Those backgrounds are not the same. And one of the things that I want to remind people of is, what we've covered over time is that a number of individuals who are identifying as African American, they are actually, in fact, European. They are individuals who their ancestors were basically kicked out of Europe. That's the best way to put it. We've discussed this before. Many of their ancestors, they may be in the conscious community, but many of their ancestors were removed from Europe because of high treason. And we've talked about that. We've looked at some of the names. We've done surname analysis. We've looked at the ship records. We've looked at actual records with actual names. We've looked at hard copies. We've looked at the digital slave voyages. We've seen that there is significant cross-referencing in terms of those prison ships, those treason prison ships, and the transatlantic slave ships. And so there is a lot of cross-fertilizing going on in terms of that dynamic. And then you have individuals who came from Africa also, and then you have individuals who were actually indigenous, and they were also enslaved. So you have a number of dynamics going on. One of the problems, however, is that some individuals are really dedicated to an identity. They have a narrative in their heads about who they are and who their ancestors are. And there is a refusal in many instances to actually do the research to uncover who the ancestors are. And so many people are just sort of making up narratives as they go. And because they have latched on to this black narrative, this quote unquote black narrative, they are reluctant to then share the reality that they are in fact European. And often many of them will drop by the community classroom, or they will loudly assert, prove us wrong. And so I've done this research for quite a while now before coming to these conclusions, particularly related to the Moorish Aborigines. And so now I will offer to them, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong that your ancestors are not primarily out of Europe. Now we're going to quickly go over some of the content that we covered. And again, this information is interlocking. And so you have to really look at it with a very critical eye. You have to be able to pick up on nuances, because the topic may be about one group, but there is usually a linkage to the history and the historical narrative of another group. And so you have to have, your thinking cap really on to pick up these little links. And sometimes individuals might watch one video and might not realize that there is an ancillary video that goes right along with that one that might have been put out 3 or 4 months ago. And so it's important to kind of go through and see if there's something that is linked, or if you see something that says part 1 and part 2 and part 3, you might want to just make sure that you have seen part 1, part 2, and part 3. So some of the content that we have covered related to the Moorish Aborigines, of course, is the Mardi Gras Moors. Also, the video on identity crisis, are you an Indian or an American? Also, who is a citizen/national? Some of the information actually on the secret history of Mali and Ghana, also related. Of course, the content on the Golden Crown and Jacquemont, talking about the Mardi Gras Indians again. Also, the content related to Benin. Anything related to Benin, you want to probably check that out. And with respect to the Moors specifically, you might want to look at the information related to the 12th census, also information related to Lot and that whole narrative. Additional content to consider includes the information related to the 1493 Dum Diversas and the Doctrine of Discovery, the information related to Roman Africa, the video on slavery denial, and that is in response to the Moorish Aborigines. Also, the South Carolina slave prison ships. That is a very important one. The ADOS and Jacobite video. Also, the video on ethnicity, where just the little girls were shown in the pictures, and people were guessing about their heritage and assumed that the little girls were American Indian or Moorish, and the little girls actually are from Africa. They are in Africa, or they were in Africa. You also have the ADOS slave indexes. So that's very important, because that information is really pertinent, and you get to see a lot of what was going on in terms of the ancestral heritage of a number of people. The information on the Moors as slaves or settlers, the truth about slavery, that's another important one. Who and what is a Moor? What about Benin? Also slavery and Dum Diversas, and the information related to Shaka Zulu and the Black Panther. Now, we had several videos on tracing your ancestry. We had significant videos on tracing your ancestry. So the basic tracing your ancestry video is very relevant to the Moorish Aborigines and understanding that. Also, the information related to Dahomey and Judah. So that Kingdom of Dahomey, Kingdom of Judah, very important in Africa. Also, some of the information related to ADOS and reparations, that information is actually helpful for individuals who are Moorish Aborigines, because most of those people cannot actually prove this pre-colonial existence in terms of Native American, American Indian, Indigenous heritage. And so the ADOS information is actually very helpful. The problem is, though, that some of that information didn't get out the way that it needed to get out. There was a lot more that should have come out. However, there was a lot of obstruction from the individuals who are online, the Moorish Aborigines. So the information that they actually needed, they did not completely receive because of their own behaviors in the community classroom. And the information related to Negro islands, those Negro islands, that is also important, because one of the things that people might not understand is that when Queen Elizabeth was kicking people out, it was the Negars and the Blackamoors. And so Blackamoor and Negro is often used interchangeably. And so that's a part of perhaps the history of those islands. Also information related to the different Indian groups. You have the Arawak. You have information related to Jamaica Queens. You also have information related to some other Indian tribes that also, interestingly, seem to have Hebrew names. So that was very interesting. Also, finding your ancestors and the secrets of surnames. All of that information is very important in terms of understanding the cultural heritage of those who are Moorish Aborigines. What's really interesting in terms of content, again, is that when content was created for those who are Moorish Aborigines, there was a lot of resistance to the content. And so, in response, creating sort of counter content about, anti-ADOS content, when the ADOS information would have been beneficial for those who are the Moorish Aborigines. However, everything happens for a reason. So anyway, some of the information that, again, is helpful is the video related to the roadblocks to gaining ground for the ADOS. Also, ADOS and reparations and social justice dynamics. So the reparations versus social justice. You also have the ADOS reparations and political psychology. So that series was very important. Who is and who is not ADOS? Another important video. ADOS and the Truth Commission, very important. ADOS and the XY factor, significant because it talks about how many people actually made it here to the Americas when they didn't necessarily come straight from Africa. Again, many of the people came out of Europe, and again for high treason, and often there was just an attempt to take the land from those individuals who were actually in Europe, and so they were kicked out all over Europe. And so that's why you have all of these people who are claiming they have no slavery ancestry. However, they have largely European names, and not just your average everyday European names. Many have European names that are Spanish, Italian, German, so all over the place. Also, the video related to the 1619 voyages, that date as the onset for the transatlantic slave trade. That video related to who is a real Indian, and looking at these different physical features and looking at Elizabeth Warren's physical features to ascertain the extent to which she might have some quote-unquote Indian heritage. Also looking at who is legally included in ADOS. Also the information related to the 2020 census. All of that information is helpful in understanding something about the Moorish Aborigine heritage and narrative. And some of the very specific content for the Moorish Aborigines related to things like finding your ancestors using the Socratic method. Also, finding your ancestors looking at Indian ancestry records. We looked at the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. That was very interesting because what you saw on there was this dynamic whereby you had the Choctaw Chickasaw census, but you also got to see on the census, particularly for the Chickasaw, you got to see their slave census. So you did get to see that there was an enslavement of individuals. This is something that a number of Moorish Aborigines will deny, and that's unfortunate because it's a seeking to distort history. And it is a fact that there were enslaved individuals by the different Indian tribes. And no, it's not just the quote-unquote Native Americans. They've created a distinction there. And so also another solid video for understanding the ancestry of Moorish Aborigines is the Finding Your Ancestors, where there's content related to 1700s through 1800s in Virginia and North Carolina. Very good information. Again, information related to those surnames and those relationships to those quote-unquote white grandmothers. And so you also had information related to those kings of Florida in Africa. There's also the video related to Is Chief Warhorse Right? This is a very important video in terms of Moorish Aborigines. Also, there was the video content on Beyond Race, and this was tracing your American ancestry, sort of looking through another lens across the color line, because in some instances, individuals weren't classified based upon race. They were just classified based upon phenotype. So it would be a description of the skin tone, a description of the eyes, the hair, things like that. And so it wasn't as easy to classify people and put them in a variety of categories. You also have the video on the Native American Indian homeland, where there was a showing you the Bayou Lacombe area. Again, the 1619 video, information related to the Kingdom of Judah. There are some questions about the Kingdom of Judah and the relationship between that kingdom and the Moorish Aborigines. So it would be interesting, if individuals are interested in pursuing it further, to figure out what that whole dynamic is all about. Was this a collegial dynamic, or was there something else going on with these groups? Additional important content involved the question of who defines you and looking at boundaries and identity. Also, the content on the 13th Amendment and is Kanye West right? We also looked at Indian status. We also looked at country status. We looked at information related to racial DNA markers so that people could get a better understanding of fact versus fiction related to that. We looked at the history of the Akan and how that relates to some of the history of the Arawak. We also looked at the dynamic of stolen identity, stolen land, and a stolen legacy. So we looked at sort of stealing indigenous identity. Now there is an interesting mixed up relationship between the American Indians and the Moorish Aborigines, and people might want to look a little deeper into that dynamic. It's not clear cut. Again, in some instances, the individuals who were Moorish were cast out of Europe. In some instances, they were dispatched as conquistadors. So you have a number of dynamics going on here, and in some instances, it's possible that they were also enslaved in Africa and then brought over. Also, the video content on what is Africa is very interesting because, again, that ties back to the name of the forefather that the Moorish Aborigines are identifying with, which would be Lot. There's also the video on the original Indians looking at East Indians in those islands over by Africa, and how in terms of phenotype those individuals in those islands actually look like individuals in the Caribbean. We also looked at colorism and quasi-Nordicism to help people understand the complexity of that dynamic. It was called Blinded by the Light. And so one of the things you might note, if you know anything about the history of the Moors, is that colorism seems to follow the Moors. And so wherever the Moors are or have been, issues related to sort of caste systems and colorism, those things are highly prevalent wherever the Moors are or wherever the Moors have been. There was also content on what is your name, and so the reparations research on holding on to all of these names that people have been given over time, just so that you can complete your research and find your ancestors, if nothing else, because again, people have been given all sorts of names over time. Also, we looked at the issue of, does Africa owe land redistribution to exiled individuals, the people that they took the land from. We also looked at Africa as splitting, and this information is related to Pangea and this idea of perhaps America and the Eastern world splitting off at some point in time. We also looked at self-love and owning your identity. We looked at indigenous land trusts. And some other things we looked at had to do with biology, things like lupus and how lupus and prostate cancer, in terms of men and women in the Americas, how that reveals something about heritage. Now, prior to delving into the content related to the Aborigines, the Indians, the indigenous people of the Americas, we initially looked at information and issues and data related to what are now known as ADOS. And so we looked at things like the psychology of slavery and human rights abuse. We also looked at DNA and are you African based upon your DNA? Are you Indigenous American? Are you European? We also looked at the Y haplogroup information related to males in America. We looked at reparations in terms of equity and defenses. We looked at reparations in terms of global law, equity, and justice. We also looked at identity politics. This is also related because, again, this is all most similar to the dynamic with colorism. There is also a lot of rhetoric out there related to identity politics and these digital gender wars and these assertions that this is a matriarchy, when we all know that America is in fact a patriarchy. So that again is something that comes out of that Moorish Aborigine dialogue, all of that, the black woman is God, the Aborigine, the American Aborigine woman is God, along with a lot of conflict related to gender and a lot of bickering going back and forth with individuals related to gender. So it's an interesting dynamic. We also looked at reparations, the global response. We looked at men only and identity politics, again, related information. We looked at that dynamic of a kata and what that meant. And we also looked at this issue of censorship. And additional content that we covered involved the issue of stolen slaves and stolen land. We also looked at the dynamic of learning to love self. And not so much focus on other people and what other people are doing and trying to tear down other people. We also looked at the issue of inter-ethnic violence, and then after that we looked at the dynamic of self-destruction. The self-destruction video was very important because it was integral to the dynamics related to the Moorish Aborigines. In fact, the Moorish Aborigines were at the center of that video and often playing what's known as two sides against the middle. And so sometimes they would be the conscious community, and then they would flip and they would be the Moorish Aborigines. Then sometimes they would simply be the Moors. And so they were playing a number of roles, and then sometimes Hebrew, and then sometimes Muslim. So they were playing all of the parts in terms of the play. And so it made things very complicated, and almost they were debating with themselves, and sometimes creating a lot of chaos with their purported adversaries. So we also looked at legal standing related to ADOS, Indians, and CARICOM. And we also looked at, this was very early on, the dynamic of race not being the same as ethnicity, and how important ethnicity is versus simply race. And we also talked about the importance in terms of Moorish Aborigines for staying within the confines of the law related to paperwork and identity and things like that. So there were a number of dynamics going on, and still a number of dynamics going on, that put a number of people at risk for having significant problems. And so we attempted to address that. That was not always well received. There were also significant behavior problems in the community classroom related to the Moorish Aborigines. And so part of that had to do with pushing of a narrative and attempting to conflate narratives. And so hopefully one of the things that individuals got out of the discussions that touch and concern Moorish Aborigines is, one, the need to do your own individual tracing of your ancestors. It's not enough to talk about history on a macro level. It's important for these purposes for people to get a better understanding of history on a very micro level. It's also important for people to learn how to leave other people alone. One thing that often happens is sort of this we dynamic, and we've talked about this quite a bit. There is no we. There is no monolith. You have individuals who have diverse backgrounds. And I am intimately familiar with Louisiana, and so I know this for a fact, that the backgrounds are diverse and everyone is not the same. But when individuals have problems with boundaries, there is a difficult time respecting the fact that some people are different. Not everyone wants to be in the same collective. And sometimes individuals are uncomfortable with that. They are uncomfortable with having that distinction, that separation, that line of demarcation. And so there's a lot of forcing of narratives and trying to change the narratives of others. And part of this involved the slavery denial dynamic and all of the chaos that has ensued from that. And so, long story short, many of the individuals who are identifying as Aborigine, and they use that term, identifying as Aborigine, not only are they Aborigine, they are Moorish Aborigine, and they need to also be looking over in the direction of Europe and Western and North Africa in terms of understanding their heritage is. So if you're going to get a handle on all of the heritages, you need to start looking in many instances outside of the United States if your ancestors were colonial ancestors. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care, see you soon, and enjoy the lyrics for your song. Al-aska.